Good afternoon. My name is Lunia Masuku. I am the Director of RUSI Nairobi. I'm pleased to welcome you to the fourth webinar in the Prevention Project series. This is a series of webinars, commentary pieces, and multimedia content to accompany research papers aimed at analyzing PCV interventions with the focus on interrogating what can and what has not worked in the PCVE space. Today's webinar will take us on a journey from the UK to Kenya and back, looking at preventing and countering violent extremism through mentorship initiatives. Just a little bit about the Prevention Project before we begin. The Prevention Project is a 2-year research program focused on analyzing the efficacy of CVE interventions around the world. The project draws on data collected from 1,500 interventions carried out by about 900 organizations in 100 different countries. As a still emerging field, the PCVE space only benefits from contributions to the evidence base, and the Prevention Project has sought to help fill in gaps in research on PCVE programming. To supplement the research being discussed today, we have 2 members of today's conversation who will speak directly to their experience of mentorship programming under the European Union funded Strengthening Resilience to Violent Extremism 2 program, also referred to as Strive 2, which was implemented in Kenya from 2016 to 2020. This program had a mentorship component that included the mentorship of youth at risk to radicalization and recruitment in urban centers in Kenya. So before I introduce today's speakers, allow me to please do a bit of housekeeping. Today's proceedings, including the question and answer session, are on the record. So if you want to remain anonymous, please indicate that along with your question. After the speakers have finished presenting, there will be time for a question and answer session. And I invite you to use the Q&A function in Zoom in order to share your question. Without any further ado, allow me to briefly introduce today's panelists. Our first speaker will be Emily Winterbotham. Emily is the director of the Terrorism and Conflict Research Group at RUSI and is a senior research fellow. Her work is focused on extremism, radicalization, countering violent extremism, and peace building. Next is Dr. Tina Bilkin Christensen. Dr. Christensen was the mentorship advisor on Strive 2, and she will bring to this discussion her expertise on radicalization, disengagement, violent extremist groups, and exit processes and mentoring in Sweden as well as in Kenya. Last but certainly not least is Zainab Muhammad. Zainab served as a mentor on the Strive 2 program in Kenya. She is keen to contribute to being a positive influence on youth in her community, particularly through PCVE programming that focuses on youth and law enforcement. So Emily will start us off by introducing the paper. She'll be followed by Dr. Christensen, and then Zainab will follow Dr. Christensen and speak about her experiences as a mentor. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Lunia, and thank you to my fellow panelists for joining us today, both who have considerably more experience in the field of mentorship than I do. So very grateful for your time. As Lunia said, this is the latest in the Prevention Project series. This paper examines the effectiveness of mentorship interventions in preventing and countering violent extremism. It was released on Wednesday, so please go to the RUSI website and to the Prevention Project site if you would like to download it. So the paper looks at mentorship interventions, which tend to be targeted interventions focused on the specific needs of individuals or groups of individuals and adapted to the local environment. So there are activities that take place between individuals who have been identified to be at risk of violent extremism and more experienced people, commonly known as mentors. Now, mentors can be anyone. It can be peers, sports coaches, community police officers, youth workers, essentially anyone who the individual who is identified to be at risk can trust. I need to note from the outset that we were focused on prevention. So it means a lot of the useful material on different types of mentorship interventions, particularly, and I know Lunia mentioned Tina's work in this space, the exit programs that are based in Sweden, Denmark, Germany, and elsewhere, or another kind of well-known program in Saudi Arabia, are not included in this analysis because they are working with individuals who have already been seen to be, have already been radicalized or already convicted of terrorism offences. So what did we do? The literature review applied systematic techniques to evaluate and synthesize findings across 27 studies. So it's 27 different pieces of literature. We do acknowledge from the outset that evaluations of mentoring programs are limited in number and in scope. This is common to the PCVE field. We know this in all of the other papers that we've presented. The evaluations themselves also lack well-developed theories of change. They can be over-reliant on anecdotal evidence. And this means it's really difficult to draw causal links between mentoring and positive PCVE outcomes. And yet, this paper, I think, is probably the most positive. We were cautiously optimistic about the effectiveness of mentorship approaches. The evidence reviewed was actually of good quality. So 14 out of 27 studies was some form of evaluation, and nearly half of those 27 studies said that mentorships were potentially effective. The one drawback that I will admit before I turn to the findings are that all of the papers we included in the review, all but 4 of them, focused on interventions that were implemented in Western and developed contexts. We don't know how this happened. It could be because we were focusing on the prevention space rather than on the kind of de-radicalization, disengagement space. But there was a preference in the literature for looking at the UK, for looking at Denmark, for looking at Australia. And because of all of the work that RUSI has been doing in Kenya, Kenya was actually the sort of outlier. So I think that needs to be taken into account when we consider the findings. So what were the findings? Firstly, linking back to that point, the focus on Western context in the literature raises questions about how transferable the findings are. So it doesn't mean that mentoring doesn't exist outside the West, nor that it won't work outside the West. And in fact, Strive Kenya has shown that it can work very well. But the fact is that interventions elsewhere were not really captured in this review. This is, clearly problematic if we're looking at trying to consider the generalizability of conclusions around effectiveness. It's hard to know how transferable the lessons learned from this study are to non-Western contexts. And that's particularly the case when we think about the fact that mentorships as tailored interventions, as targeted interventions, can be very costly, both in terms of time and resources. And so it's not inevitable that developing contexts will have sufficient resources to implement these types of programs. So we kind of tentatively conclude, or we suggest it needs further exploration, that it may be difficult to transfer the results of mentoring programs in Denmark, for example, where there's a heavy emphasis, and Tina might reflect on this herself later, there's a heavy emphasis on multi-agency approaches, so lots of different agencies working together. It will be hard to replicate this in fragile and conflict-affected states, for example, or countries where this type of infrastructure is lacking. So the second key finding is an unsurprising one, is that mentoring programs can be stigmatizing. And we know this across the PCVE field, but it's particularly relevant, I think, when we consider mentorships because they are targeted interventions. So for example, one popular approach in mentorships was something called positive youth development. And this is an approach based on creating different types of competencies among mentees, different social connections, increasing their confidence to be able to pursue education or obtain jobs. And yet these programs in the literature and in the evaluations were largely targeted at youth from marginalized communities or at those with recent immigrant backgrounds. And that creates the perception that these programs are based on the assumption that young Muslims frequently struggle with their identity and are therefore more vulnerable to radical thoughts or influence by violent extremism. And this in and of itself can undermine effectiveness. So we suggested that programs need to be cautious about the assumption that mental vulnerability is primarily associated with Islamist radicalization rather than, for example, right-wing extremism. Another area in this regard is that many mentoring schemes are linked to the promotion of democracy and liberal values. So you can have mentors working with mentees to try and inform them about democracy, to talk to them about values. This is heavily seen in the Danish approach. But this can give the impression that certain groups, i.e. young Muslims, are in particular need of role models, or that they do not believe in democracy. And this can have unintended negative consequences in terms of contributing to radicalization. And yet, the third finding was that mentorships do need to be targeted. So we do need to be able to identify who are at risk. Where mentees are poorly selected, the impact on violent extremism will likely be reduced. I mean, that makes sense. If you're not working with those who are actually vulnerable to violent extremism, your impact on reducing violent extremism will be limited. So the evidence suggests that programs that have well-developed risk assessment and referral services are potentially more effective. And in fact, the programs that have those in place and that take them seriously and do them well were able to gain trust and to actually encourage people to join voluntarily. And the evidence seems to suggest that consensual participation is likely more effective. Though I would admit, I don't think there's enough literature on this, and it's definitely worth exploring further. A fourth conclusion or finding was that approaches that equip individuals with life skills are potentially effective. So we can't change all of the things that are going on in people's lives. We can't change the situational factors or the life conditions. But there is some evidence that helping mentees to develop balanced life skills, so having vocational skills or cognitive skills improved, can help mentees handle these life challenges, the daily issues that will arise in everyone's life, in a non-violent way. And we suggest that this is worth looking at in different contexts and having more evidence around. We do, however, need to be careful, I think, with programming in terms of promoting confidence or self-esteem. So there was a warning in the literature that interventions that unilaterally aim to boost self-esteem can actually encourage narcissism, aggression, or antisocial behavior. And interestingly, and this might be something that Zainab talks about, but Strive 2 suggested that mentees noted that their feelings of contentment were actually lower after the program because they had more confidence and more self-esteem and therefore had developed higher aspirations for their lives. So I think this just reflects the need to balance what we're trying to aim to do with what the potential repercussions are. The jury is also out on the impact of creating alternative social networks. So some programs are based on the assumption that you can counter the influence of violent extremism pull factors. So pull factors such as the need for belonging, the need for identity that can be mitigated by creating new or enhanced social ties. In part, this is true, and we found that the positive relationship between mentors and mentees is key to the process of meeting such needs. The research did reveal that mentors can represent an alternative worldview to that presented by violent extremists. The issue is that there still is a potential for harm or negative outcomes if that mentor-mentee relationship doesn't work. And this actually wasn't reflected on sufficiently in the literature. And I would be interested to hear if Tina or Zainab have come across this. The other component, though, in terms of creating alternative social networks is more complicated and appears to require more resources. And it wasn't clear from our research that the creation of alternative networks was a key determinative factor in reducing violent extremism. It also wasn't clear that building awareness of the risks of violent extremism can change behaviors and attitudes. So even if you increase people's knowledge about the threats of violent extremism, there was no kind of real evidence that this would mean that people would change their behaviors or change their attitudes. So there was no evidence that people transfer knowledge gained in programs, so programs telling them about violent extremism, into real life situations. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that, the appeal of violent extremist groups is hard to combat particularly when their narratives are often far from irrational. So generally, unintended consequences were actually poorly explained across the literature. The fact that mentorships could raise expectations that are unlikely to be met in reality needs more attention. The fact that programs can create perverse incentives or generate local discontent among communities if mentees are seen as getting, preferential access to jobs or training, it's worthy of a lot more discussion. We do know, two more findings. We do know that mentors need to have local knowledge and links. This helps them identify people who are at risk. But also, if you have more local understanding and more local contextual knowledge, you are better able to work with those at risk of radicalization. So peer mentors was actually found to be a promising approach. Those with the same age, the same backgrounds, the same experiences, as being able to kind of work well with those at risk of radicalization. We also know that programs need to be joined up, so they need to be able to draw on local capacity and local resources, and that kind of comprehensive approach works best. And I will end with our final finding, which is probably an unsurprising one for everyone, but it's that monitoring and evaluation needs to be strengthened. The review drew on a good number of evaluations, but we need more and better evaluations. The fact that many of the evaluations we looked at were either process evaluations or those conducted from the perspective of mentors, needs to be rectified. We need more evaluations, including mentees' perspectives, or more evaluations focused on objective measurements regarding the impact of programs on areas of development. Better monitoring and evaluation could help to mitigate against future risks, such as cases where mentees are able to persuade mentors that they are no longer a threat, essentially gaming the system. But I'm conscious that I have taken up quite a little bit of time, so I will leave it there and hand back to Lunia, or hand straight to Tina.
You can hand it to me, I'll hand it over to Tina. Thanks, Emily. I think you brought up really, really interesting findings from your paper, and I'm looking forward to us having a conversation about this and tying in Dr. Christensen's experiences. So over to you, Tina.
Thank you, and thank you, Emily. It sounds really interesting, the paper and also the findings that you're talking about. I'll continue in the same lane, in the sense that I have been trying to identify what I think is most important in these programs. And I think, as you said, that mentors in a way could be everybody, but I'll go the other way around and say that the task of a mentor could be done by anybody, but a mentor as such is not the same as anybody just doing these kind of approaches to a person. So in my perspective, what is important if you want to build a good mentorship program, that is to start with the context. I have identified around 7 points that I'll try to present within my 7 minutes. But what is important is that radicalization, extremism, and terrorism happens as a response to a broader context of macro social and political moves, both locally, national, and internationally. And for a mentorship to have any possibility of success, I think it's really important that this context is known and understood to the program managers, and to build into the theory of change as well. And this should also be a known setting and understood by mentors and stakeholders over time. Then again, also mentorship is an approach both involving the individual and a broader social setting. But it's really in that sense crucial that the social context laying behind young people's engagement in political violence is understood and acknowledged. And this is because there's so many programs. I think this is under change, but there's a lot of mentoring programs who is focusing very much on the individual, where the individual will be put in a position where, if it depends on the individual's capability in a way to achieve success or failure, where the context is not really put into focus. The other thing is the aim of the program, and aim of mentoring is change. And in that perspective, I think it's really important that there's an understanding of identity. And this should also be disseminated over time to mentors. And the understanding of activity is that, to identity is that it needs to be understood as open, that we are not just born with a character, but we are actually changing according to what we do in life, what social networks we're involved with, and so on. And this also involves that if we have that understanding of how we develop identity, that's the only way that mentoring in a way makes sense. So that needs to be part of the context as well, these two things, the understanding of the social political context and an understanding of identity as changeable. Then it's also important to have a good organization of the program. And when I look to the programs Drive 2 in Nairobi or in Kenya, and also to the ones I did my PhD on, Exit in Sweden, there and also a lot of other programs, then you have managers who are in a way in charge of the daily organization of the program. And then you could have what was the case in Kenya and also in Sweden, that there's kind of lead mentors who knows this context that the youth they're trying to work with. They know the context they're involved with, and they get help from the managers in the program. So there's like different steps involved in setting up a mentorship program, in the sense that you have managers, you have a mentorship advisor, could it be, and you have a lead mentor. And when I say a mentorship advisor, it is possible that you have, like they had in Exit Sweden, there they had a lady behind the program who knew a lot about social interaction. So she would know about the component making up what mentorship is all about. And that is changing people and changing their behavioral and cognitive outlook on the world. So if you have that within the program, you maybe not need somebody to advise you, but it's just important to emphasize that there needs to be this understanding. Then it's also important what Emily was also saying, that a mentorship program is connected to other actors. And I've heard some saying, well, we are not a social program. We are a mentorship program focusing on preventing violent extremism. But mentors and mentees alike, they need to have a further perspective. And since we won't change, it's important to give them that further perspective along the way. So it's important to have other actors, you could say, involved, who could maybe help the project understand what is the problem, what kind of problems will you be struggling with. You might be, which is coming among former right-wing extremism, at least before, that you had problems with substance abuses in a lot of different ways. You might have a violent behavioral routine. You might, when these things start changing, you might want to have a job or get engaged in education. So it's to build a setup where you're all the time trying to lead and get more information from others, you could say. Then it's also important that the mentors, they reflect the target group. And that goes at least initially. Maybe if it's right-wing extremism or extremist, it's important that you maybe have more males than female mentors, that you have white people, that you have the same age group. And then maybe 3 months later, you can start connecting other people in, because you don't want to, in a way, oppose the worldview, still influencing and informing the people, the person you want to help change. So it's important to really consider what kind of mentors are we introducing, and then later on we can introduce a lot of other kind of people positioned in multiple ways, but really to consider what kind of mentors and what kind of mentees are we dealing with. And I think in Kenya, for example, they were within the same age bracket. They came from the same environment. In Exit Sweden, it was mainly former neo-Nazis who looked like former, some of them, others didn't. But they knew the game. They could kind of copy the bodily knowledge, you could say, but they could also switch and be the mentor. So they can play these different roles, which is important to keep people hanging on depending how much involved they have been. Then also depending on the target group, I think it's important to have somebody who could help you give a risk assessment of a mentee to secure the mentors. And these people could be recruited depending on if you're using formers as mentors, they could be helping in risk assessment, or it could be somebody else. Then mentors, it needs to be well worked out who to recruit and why you're recruiting them based on which criteria, and also having good strategies not to stigmatize people. Then the two last point is the pairing of mentor-mentees is important, and it's quite difficult also to know who will kind of be having a good relation with who. But building a trustful relation with mentorship is really dependent on, is also something you can learn mentors to understand over time. And when I say over time, quite often, it is to indicate that mentors, they become mentors by doing it and being supported in doing it. Instead of us expecting to go out and find the right mentors who can just do the job. I think it really is, as it was in Exit Sweden, as it was in Kenya, that you become a good mentor over time. And this is where the social organization of the program comes in, and why you need somebody who understands the social context, the social interaction, and what is the problem seen from the perspective of the mentees. And that was all.
All right, thank you, Tina. I appreciate your contributions there. And I think it's very fitting that one of your last points is that mentors learn how to become mentors by simply doing it. So it'll be nice to hear what Zainab has to say in terms of her experience under the Strive 2 program as a mentor. Over to you, Zainab.
Thank you very much, Lunia, Tina. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about our mentorship program on the ground. So us as mentors on the ground, what happens is we try to offer an alternative and a positive social network for the youths at risk of radicalization and engaging in violent gangs and groups. So first thing, as a mentor, you need to know the criteria that we use to select our mentees on the ground. So we have close peers who are related to maybe family members who have directly been affected by radicalization into violent gangs, especially people who maybe they have a cousin or a brother or a sister who was recruited, or people who are almost at risk of getting directly radicalized and recruited into the groups. So as mentors, it's important to understand our criteria and the people who we're going to work with on the ground. And we must know the 5 stages of mentorship. We know we have to build trust. We have to have confidence in our mentees. You need to respect their opinions, and you need to respect where they're coming from, because they're all coming from the same areas in this county. So we don't live so far from their situations, and we're able to understand where they're coming from and some of the challenges that they have. Mostly I would like to go into the positive side of mentorship. By working with the youth coming from the different areas where we come from, when you grow up from a certain area, you understand the challenges that come within that area. So you are in a better position to understand what the mentee is going through. especially during if they talk about the challenges they have at home and how things are. And some people come from poverty, so they tell you it's really hard. And sometimes to earn a living, they resort into joining crimes. So through the mentorship program, we've been able to support youths to have reliance. They think with their own mind. They can be able to make decisions without going back to the group where they've been. Maybe when you sit with the youths, most of them, they talk about how the situation is hard. They always just want to talk about the problems and never about the solution. So through mentorship, you draw this youth away from that company that makes them feel not hopeful about life and not hopeful about the future. You talk to them, you tell them that there's more to life than just feeling like you're down and like there's nothing there for you. So by talking to them, mentorship has enabled the mentees to embrace opportunities. For example, Red Cross Kenya was giving youths in Mombasa an opportunity to come up and create groups so that they can be able to support them to earn a decent living. In these groups, mentees were to choose themselves, a group of 11 mentees. They were taken for a training. They were taught on how to work together as a team, how they can open up a successful business as youth. And then later they were given the support they needed for opening their groups or their different businesses that they wanted to venture in. In Kisauni, we have Adventurous Minds, where they wanted to open a group and they wanted to do events management and go do services of food. Then we have the one in Likoni where they wanted to open up a fish shop. So Red Cross was able to support them by giving them the equipment that they needed to start their businesses. And then through also having these businesses, we've been able to reduce them at risk of engaging into radicalized groups because they have been busy trying to develop their groups, trying to make themselves better in these groups. They have been occupied. So you'll find that before that, they'll just, even if you talk to them, and find they listen to you, because mentorship also takes time. It's not something where you sit with somebody and overnight they will change. It's a process. It takes time. It takes a lot of tolerance and patience. But when these mentees are occupied in their groups, they're able to think about their future, think about how they can help themselves, think about how they can show the community what they're truly about and not the negative side. We've also been able to, the mentees have also been able to find their skills and talents through storytelling. Through storytelling, mentees are able to speak to the youth and community to show them who they are, where they come from, and where they stand. You know, sometimes it's not easy for somebody to come and tell you what they're going through. But when you give them opportunities to be able to talk in front of the camera and video themselves and talk about their life so that you can understand more where they're coming from. By them telling the stories of their life, they're not only talking about what they have been, they are given an opportunity to show the community and fellow youth where they're coming from and why they have chosen the other path and not joining such gangs and what made them turn around in their lives. We also had digital literacy training where the mentees are now aware of harmful information on the internet, especially pertaining to propaganda, videos that have been circulating, especially during these times of COVID-19, to either separate youth or create religious wars amongst the youth, which with these trainings that they've had, they are more aware. And when they see such information, they're not quick to share. They maybe share with their mentees so that they can find out more information about whether the video is true or it's biased and how they can tackle such issues. And also it gives the mentors an opportunity to ask more questions to the mentees pertaining the source of where the information is coming from and how they can assist in finding out who is creating such rumors that may affect the mentee and maybe fellow youth if this information is shared. We've also had trainings on terror. We've had, extremist dialogue. where we had Sheikh Lotome, and we had a session with him around 1 day whole session of training. With mentees, we have both Muslims and non-Muslims mentees. So it was good for us to make the non-Muslim mentees understand why it's important to separate Islam from radicalization. For them to understand that terrorists are not related in any way to Islam. So when we had an expert come in, talk about religion and be able to answer questions that maybe some of the mentors were not in capacity to answer concerning religion, it was very helpful for the mentees. They were able to understand the difference between Islam and terrorism and how they use courts to manipulate religion to make people believe that Islam is all about terrorism. So some of the questions that the mentors were not able to answer, Sheikh Leitome was able to talk to them, and after the training, there was a difference because they were now more aware of religion and what terrorism is about and how they use religion, some of the quotes from the religion to manipulate the situation. So, and then we also have psychological debriefing, which have been very useful to the mentees because they give them an opportunity to communicate and connect better with their families, and not only mentors, but families at home. Sometimes when you're talking to your mentee, they may not be very quick to open up about their home situation and what's making them feel grumpy at times. But with the psychological support that you find the mentee is more willing to open up about where they're coming from. And then once they understand why they are angry and how
Zainab, I'm
they
sorry.
can
I'm sorry, we're running over time, so I just want to say you have one more moment before we transition to the question and answer session.
Okay, thank you so much. So and also we've been able to talk to the mentees to help them build a better relationship with the police, because we want them to understand that the police are there to help them from the different communities where they're coming from, and that if they have any problem, they can rely on going to the police and reporting in case of any incident from where they're coming from. And if they are afraid, they can talk to us mentors and to see how we can help them find justice in case they're in trouble or they feel like they know somebody who might be getting themselves into trouble. Thank you so much, Luni.
Thank you, Zainab. And in fact, since I had to cut you off, Zainab, I think we might start the Q&A session with a question for you that you might be able to answer. And I think Dr. Christensen and Emily may also be able to contribute to. So we've gotten a couple of questions that really speak to people wanting to know a little bit more about the selection criteria as regards the mentees. I believe for the Strive 2 program, you had a primary as well as a secondary set of criteria. Could you, Zainab, speak to that? And Dr. Christensen and Emily, if you have anything to add, please do so.
So our primary criteria, we have close peers or relatives recruited into violent groups. The mentee has to be associated with violent criminal gang members. They have to hold violent and radical extremist views and tendencies. They also have to be affiliated with holders of extremist views and tendencies. For the secondary criteria, we have being school dropouts. We have dysfunctional family backgrounds. Mentees who are coming from dysfunctional family backgrounds. And then we have suddenly becoming social withdrawn from maybe their fellow peers, the community. They just want to keep to themselves. And being a former recruit of a gang.
Thank you, Zainab. Dr. Christensen and Emily, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add to that in terms of the selection criteria for mentees.
I mean, I'd only add that I think this is an example of good practice in the sense that, you know, there was a clear criteria for inclusion. When you look across the different mentorship programs in the literature, it's not always clear. And I think we don't want to do the programs a disservice because maybe sometimes they just don't articulate it for sensitivity reasons, but it's not always clear that there is a clear understanding of who's been included. And so one of the concerns that we had was that some of the criteria for inclusion can be quite broad. So it can be literally, young people of a certain age in marginalized communities, which doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be working with those who are most at risk of radicalization. So that's definitely a concern that can undermine program effectiveness. So the kind of approach that Zainab has articulated and that we've seen in a number of different programs of really being able to kind of come up with some risk factors, we would say, some very clear risk factors, ensuring that the right people are referring those people to, because it's not inevitable that everyone, we put a lot of weight on people in the community, for example, or a lot of weight on teachers to be able to spot these signs. And it's not inevitable that people really know what the signs of radicalization are. And, risk assessments and referral processes really need to be strong so that we don't end up stigmatizing and identifying the wrong people.
Yeah, thank you for your responses on that. And actually the next question is—
I think Tina might want to respond now.
Sorry, Dr.
But I also think it's really important in these criteria that we are not using words like radicalized sometimes, or at least that these words are defined, because we still do not agree about the content of that word. So really pinning it down, what is it we mean if we use that word, then have an extra sentence saying what does that mean.
Really important point to bring up, Dr. Christensen. Appreciate that. The next question that we have that does in fact deal with something that Emily brought up earlier, as well as in terms of stigmatization, as well as the idea of factors that can end up undermining a program. We've got a question about if there have been differences in programs, differences in the way that stigmatization has impacted males or females involved in mentorship programs with the CVE focus, and if this difference in terms of males and females being more vulnerable to stigmatization was identified, how has it, in some of the research you've done, Emily, how has it been overcome, if it was?
Yeah, I mean, I'll reflect briefly on it, because honestly, the concern about stigmatization comes up as a kind of more of a policy concern, actually, than the programs themselves talking about stigmatization. I think there's a bit of a disjuncture in the literature in that regard. But, the tendency, mentorships tend to be, at least at least when you're related to Islamist violent extremism, but tend to be with young people. Young people in the PCVE space tends to mean men. So, it tends to be young men being stigmatized in terms of those, who are more likely to be radicalized. There's obviously reality about that too, but that was one of the key points made in the literature. But I don't know if kind of Tina and Zainab had particular experiences, particularly because obviously there was a gender focus in the STRIVE program, and whether that was a concern and something that you looked to kind of overcome in the programming side.
Or Zainab will know more about that from being much closer to the mentees in that sense. But I think it's going to change that it's mainly female or males being involved in the program. And thereby this discussion might also change, in the sense that at least within the people being recruited to Islamic State, there was quite a few women as well with very active roles. So, and also within a Kenyan setting, quite a few females are involved. So, but you can expand on it, Zainab.
Please, Zainab, if you have something to add, the floor is yours.
I didn't quite catch what you said, Lunia. Kindly.
The question was about stigmatization and in these mentorship programs, and if there are experiences of stigmatization between males and females, if they experience it differently, and if so, your experience of the STRIVE 2 program, if you noticed that, and if so, what what measures were you equipped with, or did you see the program use in order to try to address the stigmatization?
I think for us as mentors, we know that when we are in a group, maybe we meet for the bi-weeklies, we understand that sometimes the community is interested to know what we are doing and what the meetings are all about. So when we have our bi-weekly meetings, we try as much as we can to involve the community to also come in and listen to what we are doing and what we are talking about. So it helps for the mentees who live around that certain area so that the community can understand what they're doing. And most of them tend to appreciate the project of mentorship and what we are doing, because they understand we're just not youth who are coming together to talk about things that are not useful, but how we can build each other and our future. So there isn't a lot of stigma, especially when we try and bring in the community to come in and listen to some of our sessions. At least in every sub-county where we hold our meetings, we try as much as we can to bring in a few community members so that they can listen in and they know what we are doing. So we haven't really have a lot. Maybe stigma comes from when they look at the police and how they're dressed with their dress code. We try and also talk to our mentees about that, because with police, there's always, they already identify when youth put on such a hairstyle and dress in a certain way, they could be looked at as criminals. So those are some of the things that we try and talk to them on how to behave if they come close to a police officer or they see police doing their patrols in their areas.
Thank you. So we've got another question that, again, I think might be suitable for all of the panelists potentially to answer, that speaks to the psychosocial support that's offered in mentorship programs. And the question is focused on the idea of how mentorship programs can ensure that mentors themselves are not harmed by virtue of being a part of the program, as well as exposed to people that have undergone significant traumas. And perhaps, Zainab, since you just finished answering that, we can start with Dr. Christensen if you have a response to that question.
I think this is where I'll start again. This is where the organization of a mentorship program comes in, that you have somebody who can supervise the mentors. Now, for example, with Exit Sweden, where it would be formers mainly who would be mentors. If they had they had a rule that you have to have been outside of the group or left that environment for 2 years before you could become a mentor in that program. But still, some of the guys, they were experiencing that the experience the the mentees had came too close to their own feelings, which would have too much of an impact on them. But they will undergo supervision and they will potentially get another mentee. So the match would be different. But I think this is where mentoring is involving a lot of social knowledge, a lot of psychological knowledge. So you need these people on board, also depending on how heavy you could say the target group is.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen. Emily, did you want to answer this question as well?
No, it didn't really come up in the research, and I'm just sort of scrolling down and looking. We've got quite a few Q&A questions still to come, so I'll hold comments for now on that.
Okay. And then Zainab, did you want to give a comment at all to this in terms of speaking from your experience as a mentor? That was enough.
Okay, thank you very much, Lunia. I would say as mentors, sometimes we do take the mentee situation home. We take it at heart and we take it home. Sometimes listening to the experience that they've had can be very overwhelming. But with the support that we've been getting from the psychological debriefs that we've been having, we're not only able to talk about it, and also it's okay sometimes to feel overwhelmed. So we share as mentors. And sometimes if the situation is overwhelming for me as a mentor and I feel I don't have the capacity to address my mentee, I call in another mentor to come in and help me. and I know sometimes people might feel like, what if the mentee is not comfortable with that situation? We can make them understand. And with the sessions that we've been having with Diana, and both the mentors and mentees there, so I'm able to talk to Diana to speak to my mentee on a professional level. So it helps the mentee, and it also helps me to be able to know how I can handle the mentee, because some situations are so fragile and you need to take them with a lot of calmness, and you need to understand where they're coming from, and you don't want them to stop themselves from sharing just because you're getting overwhelmed hearing about their situation, because you'd want them to talk about it so that they can feel better. Sometimes talking about the situation, it makes them feel lighter. Yeah. So with Diana's help, it helps them, when they talk about it, they come back and say, I felt so good that I talked to Diana. And now I hope you understand my situation and maybe why sometimes I change my moods and all that. So mentors also work very closely in supporting one another, especially in situations where a mentor may be overwhelmed about the mentee's situation.
Thank you, Zainab. I think it's really, really important to hear that mentors are providing that support for each other. And for the audience, just so there's reference, Diana is a registered psychologist that worked under the Strive 2 program and provided the psychosocial support for the mentors. And then during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the program was running, we also extended that support to mentees as well. So we've got another question here from Jodeci. The question is, what I think is perhaps best directed towards Dr. Christensen and Emily. What are the biggest differences for this program when working with extreme right-wing elements versus Salafi jihadists? You noted that the model may not be transferable between regions, and does that potential challenge on making the process transferable between extremist movements complicate mentorship program efforts?
So the transferability was actually that the literature that we gathered was heavily focused on Western countries. So it was on analysing mentorship programs in Denmark, for example, or in the UK. And so one of the concerns we had was that our findings might not be transferable. But the potential risk is that, programs, and Tina will know this far better than me, but programs in Denmark, for example, that are shown to be potentially effective, they do rest on this multi-agency approach. And Tina talked about the significance of it in her comments too. Different agencies working together and being able to provide different types of support. And so the concern is that if those support structures don't exist, that actually some of the benefits of mentorship programs might not be felt. And so that's the kind of concern of having these in developing contexts or in fragile and conflict affected states. I mean, in relation to, I think, the division between different types of extremism, a good mentorship program should look at the problem at hand and should be tailored. So in essence, the mentorship program can work with whatever type of extremism is the issue, as long as it's designed sensitively around the individual that you're working with, and has the right, and then Tina talked about this a lot as well, has the right mentors in place to be able to deal with the problems that might arise. We know from the research that programs that have tried to overemphasize religion, for example, haven't necessarily been that impactful, because actually the reason why people have been attracted to a violent extremist organization is multifaceted, and religion is, maybe one component or a small component of that. So mentors need to be able to be flexible enough to respond to the concerns, the challenges, the questions that come up during the mentorship process. So I think it's more about, ensuring that there are systems in place that can support the mentors as well, which, as Zainab's pointed out, we had a counsellor. I mean, these are not cheap, small programs, they do require a lot of support. And that was kind of the concern I was raising.
I can just add that this is where the context come in, like you're also saying, Emily, and that is why it's so important to know the context, because there's a lot of similarities, and especially between jihadists and right-wing extremists in the worldview that they're building up the context and historical and everything else is different, but there's some huge similarities involved as well. So I think it's really important to understand the context, which is also giving a clue about reasons for joining. And that is giving you also an idea about what problems do mentees struggle with beforehand, which will have an impact on the afterhand or aftermath, you could say, about the possibilities and issues when it comes to reintegration into the mainstream society afterwards. Beside that, I also think, and that goes for every program, and this is one of the major issues that I would like to bring so much up front, is that a lot of these programs, they are focusing on ideology. And when I look, which I learned from, I know quite a few by now, former right-wing extremists, that you kind of learn a bodily routine. You learn a way of doing your life. You learn a way of solving conflicts. You learn a way of intimidating people and so on. And I think when it comes to, if we're talking about people who have been engaged in violence, it's so important that mentorship programs are addressing that when you talk to me and you maybe disagree with me, you're not going to walk up front in my face trying to intimidate me to get your way through. So these kind of issues should also be handled within mentorship programs. But I think all in all, we can transfer a lot of knowledge when it comes to the program as such, dealing with the mentees. But when it comes to the contextual setup, like Denmark is in a way a bad example, because Denmark is a welfare state, a universal welfare state where we pay a lot of taxes, but also get a lot of benefits. And that perspective or aspect is not transferable to 80% or more of the world. So in that sense, and also the way the Danish so-called model is set up is based on us having a huge information sharing. I think one of the most loose legislations in the world of who can share information with whom. So these are factors which are difficult to translate or non-translatable. So I think we should focus on programs and the programmatic setup, and not the laws and money and all these kind of things when we talk about mentoring and sharing experiences.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen. So if I could indulge or have the indulgence of the participants as well as the panelists, I think I may ask one more question and then wrap it up from there. We've unfortunately come close to the end of our timing here, but we have so many questions, so many really good questions that have come from the audience. I'd just like to ask one last question that I think all of the panelists can answer, that speaks to sustainability. And that speaks to the finite resources that exist, whether it's coming from a government or a donor organization to support PCVE mentorship programs. And I'm wondering, particularly in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what I imagine are, there's a little bit more dependency in that relationship between the mentee and the mentor for support at this, during this time frame. How do you suggest, or Zainab, in your case, how have you approached the relationship between mentors and mentees when program cycles end, when funding for mentorship programs end? And perhaps if we can start with Zainab and then go to Emily and then Dr. Christensen.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to talk, I talked earlier about the groups that the mentees formed when they were being supported by Red Cross so that they can help themselves with their livelihood. Right now, when I was talking about the mentees being occupied, they're working so hard to make sure that they develop their groups in the business that they are doing. And for mentorship doesn't end because the project has come to an end. That is why we come from the areas that these mentees come from. If they need me, they can come and talk to me. If they have an issue, I'm just a phone call away. So we try as much as we can, as much as even if the project has come to an end, we still have our WhatsApp group. We communicate there, we talk to them, we give them a call from time to time to see how they're doing, because you wouldn't want to leave this person who is, we call them our children. We always want to make sure that they're okay, and we check up on them. If they can come up to my place and we talk, we can always do that. But right now we're focusing on encouraging them to work really hard in their different groups so that they can be able to build an income to sustain themselves. We're trying to encourage them that even if there's this pandemic going on, life has not come to a stop, and they can channel their ways around. And some of them, they have been able to work their way around this pandemic. They've been able to look at new things that they can embark on to be able to sustain themselves during this period. So with constant communication with our mentees, the communication doesn't stop after the project. We always keep on talking and keep on keeping in touch to make sure that they're okay. And if we get any opportunities on our side, we forward to them and we see how we can work together.
That's really, really refreshing to hear, Zainab. Thank you. Over to you, Emily.
So 2 quick points. I mean, personally, I'm just very glad as well that Zainab, I mean, it's a very good example of a mentor actually being there for people after programs close down, and shows how good the relationship is that is created. But I guess it's one point, which is a broader point that we found across the Prevention Project series, which is there is such a danger of particularly pilot projects, which even though they do show some signs of success, then donors have, moved on, they've got competing priorities, it's no longer as sexy a topic, whatever it is. And pilot projects that have raised expectations and given people some hope disappear, and that can create, potentially create these kind of unintended, I would say, negative consequences that I talked about, and potentially could, lead to more radicalization and really isn't a good way to be going down. But we found that across every single different theme, numerous pilot projects that start and then never go anywhere. And then the second point is just what we were, I think both Tina and I have kind of talked about, which is embedding these programs in the kind of wider social support networks, local resources, local communities, so that even if the specific mentorship program has finished, people can reach out, whether it's to, have vocational opportunities or other types of opportunities. Though, of course, that is harder when you're lacking certain types of infrastructure.
And I was actually just ended by quoting Martin Seuten, who was behind Strive 2, and say that sustainability is something which is in your mind and your head, because we are trying to indicate a change. And if we have succeeded, that's going to have an impact on the individual's agency, hopefully changing their lives and the people around them.
Really, really great way to end the conversation, Dr. Christensen. Thank you so much to all the panelists. So unfortunately, we've come to the end of the conversation today. In fact, we're a couple of minutes over time. So on behalf of RUSI, I would like to thank the panelists for participating today. I'd also like to extend a thank you to the research associates and fellows in the Prevention Project, as well as the audience, for all of your questions. I'm so sorry that we did not have the opportunity to answer all of your questions. And finally, I'd like to thank the RUSI events and communications team for running this event, with particular mention to Jivile Kulevichuta. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So for those that are interested, please watch the space. There's another prevention webinar that will be coming up perhaps in the next month or so that will be focused on youth empowerment. In the meantime, you can find all of the Prevention Project reporting, as well as videos of webinars exploring what works in PCVE on the RUSI website. You can also find information on the Strive 2 program in Kenya on the RUSI website, so that you can get more information about that. Again, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you participating in this, and have a great day and weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.